Welcome back to another episode of Count Me In. I'm your host, Adam Larson, and in today's episode, we have special guest Ben Wolf joining us to discuss the fascinating concept of fractional leadership. Ben is the founder and CEO of Wolf's as Integrators, a premier fractional COO organization. Today, we'll explore the key factors to consider when hiring fractional executives, the benefits they bring to businesses, and even dive into some real-life examples. So get ready to uncover the power of fractional leadership and how it can revolutionize your organization. Ben, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We're really excited to talk about fractional executive leadership today. And I thought maybe we could start off by maybe you can share some some of your own experiences that led you to discover this concept of fractional executive leadership and kind of how it changed your approach to leadership in an organization.
Sure, absolutely. Well, Adam, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to share about this topic. Obviously, something I'm very passionate about. And I first came across it when I was in this business that I first sort of grew up in entrepreneurially. I used to be a corporate bankruptcy attorney. And after I left that, I helped build this entrepreneurial business from startup, built most of its operations. And till we were, it was a healthcare startup until we had over 130 people and we're the largest healthcare agency of our category in the entire state of New York. So we really quite a journey. And a ways into that, well, what we and the other members of the real leadership team realized is that, all of us were kind of figuring out this business for the first time. It was the first time any of us had been running a business of our size before. I mean, we'd been employees in larger corporate businesses or, kind of cogs in the machine at various places, but first time like we're actually running a business of our size before. I mean, let's say when we're 50, 75, 100 people, we had never done this before. And so we just, everything that we're doing, we're reinventing the wheel at a certain point. We tried to, we hired an EOS implementer to like help us use this management system called entrepreneurial operating system. And so we tried to get help, and consultants usually just felt like they just kind of put together some big report and spent dozens and dozens of hours with us and members of our team and just would kind of deliver this report and say, good luck. And I just kind of call that, like drive-by consulting. And what I just realized is, sometimes that's what you need, but sometimes you need somebody that's actually on your team, that's actually like part of the business. And that's done it before. That's not just figuring it out for the first time like we were. And so we, started looking at hiring for full-time roles. And sometimes either we were just priced out. These people like 300,000 didn't necessarily make sense for this role, or, we just, we realized we need people who've done this before, and we didn't have it. And so it wasn't really till after I had left there, and I was a COO at a smaller business after that. And then I really discovered this concept of a fractional executive, where you can actually get an executive on your team that's not the like trauma if it doesn't work out, or like the cost of 300,000 plus bonus plus benefits and everything else of a full-time executive who's done this before. And also maybe somebody that you might be worried might be too corporate, for your environment. And that you could actually do that with a fractional executive. You get someone that's done it before, whether it's a CFO or a COO or CMO, CTO, CIO, CHRO, whatever, something else, and get them on. They're part of your leadership team. They're part of your management team meetings. They have direct reports within the business. And so it's kind of like the best of both worlds. You have a high-level person that's done it before. They're on your team. They get to know your business better because they're actually part of your team on an ongoing basis, not just consulting, hey, good luck, but actually managing the people and managing that department, but just doing so on a part-time basis. So I just became aware of that, and then ultimately started to do it myself, first as a solo practitioner, as a chief operating officer, fractional COO, and then ultimately started building a team, which I have now. But that's sort of like the experience I went through. It was kind of what I learned in that business growing up, and not having someone like that who'd done it before that made me aware of this sort of solution as I learned more over time.
Yeah. That's so interesting because it's if you're reading any business application, if you're reading any articles, if you're reading anything in any industry around business, you hear this term fractional leadership. And I think we may have jumped the gun. So maybe we can start by defining what is fractional leadership and how does it differentiate? Because if you're listening to this and you've maybe heard this term thrown around and people probably assume, like you were saying, maybe it's like a consultant kind of thing, but it seems like it's more than that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I basically define a fractional executive or a fractional leader as the same as a regular executive, because a regular executive, if you have your CMO or your CRO or your COO, CFO, CTO, CHRO, whatever, they're responsible for a function of the business, right? The CMO is responsible for the marketing function of this business, not one project, but the marketing of the business. The outcomes, the people, everything, just the marketing function of the business. CFO, a lot of people in your listening to this audience, maybe CFOs or other roles in the finance or accounting departments. And CFO is your CFO. They're responsible, right? They're responsible for your P&L and finding savings and forecasting and strategy, just like a full-time CFO. The only difference between a full-time and a fractional CFO is that they're there fractionally or they're part-time.
Mm-hmm.
So enables you to afford someone in that role that is maybe more experienced than you could afford on a full-time basis. So if you don't need someone with a tremendous amount of experience that's been CFO for decades at multiple businesses, or a CMO at various businesses, if you don't need that, then fine. You can hire a CMO and let them grow into the role over time or whatever. That could work.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do need someone that's done this before, you may not be able to afford or might not be able to find, just because there's a shortage, those kind of people. But by being someone fractionally, you can find someone like that, someone that higher caliber. But the way they provide that service is a little different than someone in full time. They're not going to be doing all hands on deck admin stuff, working 60 hours a week in your company. And even though they're a CFO or the COO,
Mm-hmm.
they end up doing tons of admin stuff too, right? Just because they're there full time and they're fully invested in the business, eating, breathing, sleeping, drinking the business. So they end up doing all this stuff that's not really CFO stuff. They're doing a lot of stuff that's really not CMO stuff. They're doing copywriting and graphic design and web work and all these things. So, where your CFO is kind of getting a little bit more involved than they should in the bookkeeping or the controlling,
Mm-hmm.
right? And not really being that strategic CFO. But fractional just forces you to say, okay, I want to only utilize that person at their highest and best use, at the biggest ROI that I'm going to get from them, because that's all I'm really paying for. And they will set up a cadence with the finance team or the marketing team or the operations team or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
or the technology team. They'll set up a cadence with them. They'll set up measurables and processes with the team that reports to them. They'll create accountability and a sort of a cadence for those meetings and that work, and they'll work with the rest of the leadership team. And so they're able to fulfill that role because of that cadence, the processes, and the metrics on a more condensed basis. So they might be with you for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, and then hand off to a full-time person, or you may realize that fractional can work in the long term. And there's definitely a lot of people who will end up doing that, especially in the CFO role. A lot of businesses you'll find. I've seen a lot of CFOs. You talk to Focus CFO, which is a fractional CFO franchise, 70, 80 team members. They'll be, years and years on end, just doing that CFO role on a fractional basis. But it really depends on your own unique business.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, it's an interesting model because, when somebody's especially such a high executive, you expect them to kind of be into the weeds of, leading the team and part of the strategy. How does that work in practice? Because are these fractional executives, are they working with different, like 3 or 4 different organizations at the same time? Or, how does that work?
It's a good question. People are, I would say, look, I would just take my firm as an example. Wolf's Edge Integrators, we have a team of experienced COOs who have run or owned businesses. On average, we're working with about 3 clients at a time, on average. Others, some CFOs I know maybe work with their client 4 hours a month or something like that, right? Or 8 hours a month. And so they're going to just be less involved, and they're going to have a controller and bookkeepers, whether outsourced or in-house, that they're overseeing. And so what it means is it just forces you to be able to get someone of that caliber, but helping you in the CFO, CMO, COO, et cetera, role, is it forces you to just be more strategic about how are we using that person's time? Because so often when you have executives in a business, they end up spending 50, 60, 70% of their time on non-CFO activities or non-CMO activities.
Okay.
They're doing a lot of admin. They're doing a lot of things where you're paying them a big executive salary, but you're not getting 90, 100% of their time spent on activities that are that are a good ROI on what you're paying for them.
Gotcha.
So what your fractional forces you to do, if you're using that model, is to ensure that we are outsourcing or hiring for the lower level activities so that we can ensure that everybody that, that we get a good ROI on our money. If we're like spending money on controlling and bookkeeping, we get a good ROI on that money.
Mm-hmm.
And for the whatever we're spending on our CFO, we're getting a good ROI on that money. If it truly is a full-time role in the business, then great. Then, just try to make sure that they are delegating what they should be, that they are not masking the inefficiencies of the people under them or the processes under them by babysitting them and just doing a lot of activity that's not really appropriate for someone of their caliber and capabilities. It just forces you to do that, because if you're fractional, you can't mask those underperforming employees with babysitting. You can't mask those inefficient processes and things that have to be reviewed 50 times by babysitting, because they're not there all the time. That pushes those issues to the forefront, forces you to address them, to get the right people on the team, to get the wrong people off the team, to hire the right roles, outsource the right roles, set up metrics, accountabilities, processes, and systems that will enable your team to be effective without being babysat. Because babysitting is not an option when you're fractional, but when you're full-time, it is an option. And so people end up spending a lot of their time on things that they shouldn't, and also doing what I call helicopter management, babysitting, kind of masking process and people issues that are not being addressed just because they're always there.
Well, we could definitely unpack what you just said in a lot of different ways.
That's a big one.
There's a lot of things, but we'll kind of stay focused here on fractional leadership. But, the stuff you said, I think there's a lot of things that could be addressed in organizations, what they should look for, if those things are happening in their organization, or how to identify those things. But maybe we can start with, let's say I'm a business owner listening to this podcast and you're like, this fractional thing sounds interesting. I wonder if my people are babysitting. I wonder if they're doing those things. How do you know? How can you determine whether it's a right fit for your organization? How can you make that decision? How can you see that?
Well, that's really two very different questions.
Yeah.
So you want to know if your CFO or your controller or whoever is babysitting rather than being an effective manager and leader.
That's a whole other podcast.
Well, I'll just tell you, here's a shortcut. Tell them to go on vacation for 2 weeks and delete their email off their phone. And that is going to bring to as they prepare for those 2 weeks, or as they go through the 2 weeks and you see the carnage that is left over afterwards, or all the catch-up work and everything that didn't get done or didn't happen or happened badly, that will sort of bring that issue to the forefront.
Yeah.
And then you'll sort of identify all the things that you need to correct, so that maybe, okay, 6 months, now schedule another 2-week vacation, and then maybe you could be much more prepared and fix a lot of those issues before that. Maybe you just asked that question about how you identify it.
Yeah.
And what was the other question you asked?
Well, how can you determine whether this is a right fit for your organization? So yeah, I did kind of ask the two questions, and what I asked the first time could probably be a whole nother podcast about identifying things in your leadership, but maybe focusing more on the fractional. How can you determine if this is a good fit for your organization?
I think one thing is that a lot of fractional executives are coming in usually where there's some sort of change management needed.
Okay.
And, it's not like, everything is hunky-dory. We just need sort of a manager, just to kind of manage the greatness that we already have going on. Usually there's some, maybe there's an acquisition coming up, or it's very dysfunctional, and you just really need someone who knows what a finance department is. Let's talk about the CFO role for a second. They knows what the CFO role, what the finance of a department of an organization of your type should look like. Someone who's done it, again, they've done it before. They're not figuring it out for the first time. So you want to sort of shape up our finance department to be a healthy, department, and have sort of strategic, not just a controller that just kind of manages the finance day to day, but also is actually a strategic CFO and provides strategic financial leadership. And so the point is that in any of those examples, people are going through pain. So I guess one thing that I guess would say, if you're ready, is that, are you in enough pain with whatever your situation is, or whatever situation you're about to go into, that you are in enough pain that you want change and you're open-minded to learn a better way. I think some of us as business owners, we're like, I know everything exactly that needs to be done, and I just need other people to just listen to what I say. And they're not really open-minded to, or they're not really they're not really, well, I guess just open-minded to the idea that there are experts who have done this before that you could actually bring in and, to fulfill the areas where you're lacking so that you can focus more energy, not on those things, but on the things that you have a superpower in.
Mm-hmm.
And, whether that's bringing in finance leadership, COO, leading all the departments, or, or CMO or CRO, chief revenue officer, or CTO, the HR. And, you really you're in pain in that area of the business. You want to know something better. You could say it means someone's coachable or someone like wants to know a better way. So I would say that's one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the second thing I would mention is that, well, you can afford someone of that caliber, but on a fractional basis, right? Obviously, maybe it costs $250,000, $300,000 to get someone of that caliber full-time, plus bonus, plus benefits.
Mm-hmm.
But for fractional, maybe it costs you $100,000, $150,000 a year. But you're just giving somebody that, you couldn't afford it at the full-time level, but you have to at least be able to afford someone of that level fractionally. So I guess, can you afford it?
Yeah.
Another element of whether that's going to be a right fit for you is, I guess, do you have the trust of a potential outsider after they get to know you and your business better to be able to back them up, to not end run around them, to not undermine the things that they're trying to help you build, right? So that, you want to have an independently running and effective finance department, right? But if you're going to always kind of meddle in and undo and change decisions and everything without discussing it in advance, then you're going to kind of undermine the work that you've asked them to do. So do you have the ability to back up and support the experts that you bring in onto your team, rather than just never let go and not be able to let go of the vine, as some people say, but just not be able to empower the people that you bring in to do what you've asked them to do, because they're not going to be effective at that if you're not able to let go.
So one thing I was reading about that sometimes that people are concerned about bringing in a fractional leadership is, hey, this is not a full-time commitment. How can I trust them in that moment? And what are some things that they can, think through? You kind of mentioned a little bit that they're going to have to trust them, but, how can you help with those concerns?
I think that, especially if you're talking to a solo practitioner, you can ask for references to talk to current or past clients or employers that person has, just like with any other employee, right? It's even a fractional CFO or a fractional CMO or COO, it's a critical hire or critical retention, maybe not hire. And so that's one thing you could do. Obviously, is ask for references. I know when people working with our firm, Wolf's Edge Integrators, usually our reputation precedes itself, right? So people have worked with us before. They talk to other people who've worked with us before. They know it's a reputable organization. So you can sort of rely on a reputation of an organization, which can kind of go a little further than the reputation of an individual. More people can have heard of it or might have used them. So that's another thing that you can go to. And I would say it's worthwhile to treat it like you would any other smart hire. A lot of people make a lot of bad hiring decisions. And so I think it's critical. It's critical to be, this sort of goes to another thing that maybe we were going to speak about, which is, okay, let's say I do want to hire a fractional executive of some kind. How do I make sure that I am successful in the way that I do it and that it doesn't end up with a bad result? So I would say one of the most critical things when deciding whether or not I could trust somebody and letting go, and also just in terms of making the decision whether I should retain a fractional executive or a fractional executive firm, is to really give a lot of forethought to what outcomes do you need from this retention? What skills are important? What outcomes are important? What sort of measurables are we going to be looking at in this engagement? What outcomes or goals 6, 9, 12 months down the road do we want to see? And just be very explicit about that. Write it down for yourself, communicate it openly, and then make sure that's in writing somewhere in the engagement. Hopefully if they're writing you a proposal or a contract, make sure that's in there so that there's no like misunderstanding or assumptions about what I'm actually going to be doing in this role. That it's just in writing, it's clear, it's black and white. You're able to be very much on the same page about what's expected. And I would say, listen to your gut. If you're having a couple of calls with somebody, or you have another member of your team or your partner or another member of your leadership team that talks to the proposed person that you might be working with, just listen to your guts. And if you feel like they just have this preformed narrative, let's say, about what they do with all their clients, but it's not the same as what I want to get out of this engagement. That's why it's important to write it down in advance before you even speak with somebody. What outcomes do I want? What am I looking for? What skills do I need? and then just make sure, are they aligned with that? Do they seem to get it? And that's something I would say. So references, reputation, being very clear about what you want and getting the agreements in writing so that there's no misunderstanding about what outcomes or accountabilities are going to be in place.
Are there certain industries or sizes of business where a fractional leader makes more sense?
I think it depends. I think it depends on which fractional role you're talking about.
Okay.
For instance, a company is going to need a full-time CFO sometimes before they need a full-time CMO, let's say.
Okay.
Or they're going to need a full-time chief sales officer or chief revenue officer before they need a full-time CMO. I'm just saying, like, you could have a 25, 30 person business that maybe needs a fractional CMO, but maybe they need a full-time CFO or a full-time head of sales, because that's the driver of the whole, revenue of the business is sales. So maybe they need a full-time person in the sales role, although there are fractional sales leaders as well. But, maybe you need that sales role needs to be full-time before the marketing role needs to be full-time. And you could have fractional chief marketing officer. You get someone with a much more extensive experience than you could get if you tried to hire somebody full-time, right? You just end up with somebody that knows, that knows copywriting really well, or knows graphic design, or knows social posting really well, or maybe they knows PPC, pay-per-click, maybe they know really well, but they're not going to be a real strategic CMO to create your entire strategy and drive execution and all the resources of that. Like, just may not make sense to hire that kind of CMO when you're only 30 people. This may not make sense.
Yeah.
I'm going to see HRO, for example, right? Sometimes you could have you might bring in an HR generalist, not really a chief people officer, but an HR generalist. You can have that full time, but when you're 50 people, but maybe it's not till you're 150 people or 200 people that you need a fractional chief. That you need a full-time HR person.
Mm-hmm.
But you can get somebody. Maybe when you're only 75 people, a fractional. So depending on the role, I would think it sort of depends when you need certain roles as full-time versus when you need them as fractional.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you're thinking about this fractional role, I'd imagine in today's work environment with remote working, hybrid, all those things that are prevalent, a fractional executive doesn't necessarily need to be need to be able to come to the office like all the time. And especially if they're meeting or if they live in a different location, how does the fractional leader adapt to those types of situations? Let's say a company is completely remote and you're never actually going to see anybody in person. Are there certain tools that they can use to maintain and help the leaders kind of maintain that connection and productivity as they're coming into certain organizations?
Yeah, well, certainly if it's a mostly remote business to begin with, or largely remote, or even partially remote, obviously that makes it a lot easier,
of course,
and just a lot less limited to any geography in terms of finding somebody. With my firm, Wolf's Edge Integrators, most of our fractional COOs are not working in person on a week-to-week basis. But for most of our clients, they do come out at the beginning of the engagement.
Mm-hmm.
We'll start to build that rapport with the leadership team in person, and then they'll be there for quarterly and annual planning sessions. They'll get together in person for that too, for most of our engagements. And then but on a week-to-week basis with the teams, it's remote. That's definitely the majority of the time, because, let's say just in the United States alone, obviously you're all over the world, but even just in the United States alone, you have the likelihood of having like a right fit person that happens to live within 10, 20 miles of your physical main location is not that likely, right? So definitely helps to be open-minded to that. In terms of tools, I think it's important wherever possible to have those in-person touch points and create that relationship, because they are a trusted member of your teams. I think it is helpful where possible to have that. Sometimes businesses are really all over the world, and it's just never practical to have everybody getting together, at least even on the leadership team level, everybody getting together in person. And so you just do those quarterly annual plannings and meetings all on Zoom. That's just how the entire thing is done. That's definitely good tools. And, because if you're setting up measurables and processes, obviously it's important, and there's a lot of systems that work for this, but it's important to have those systems somewhere that everybody has accessible to. So if you're using a CRM to manage your sales or operations or, processes, just, make sure that the fractional executive is in that system just like everybody else, and everybody has transparency to what everybody else is doing. There's for managing meetings and projects and accountabilities of managing the business, I find that an online system like 90.io, NINETY.io, is a good platform for managing meetings and sort of major projects and major goals and managing the business and outlining the vision and the structure and the accountability chart or the organizational chart and just kind of managing all of that in a place where everybody has access to it with full transparency. I think a system like that is good. There's another app that does that called Catapult.ai. There's another good one. There's an app called Bloom Growth that does it. I mean, I could keep going on and on about this, but there's a lot of good systems that are good for managing companies and getting everybody on the same page. That is especially relevant, even if you're all in the same place, but especially relevant if people are not physically together.
So we can't talk about fractional CFO without thinking about people could be listening to this saying, that's interesting. I think I could do that. What are some considerations somebody should think about or steps they should take when thinking about going at this type of thing, whether through as a solo person or joining an organization that does that, kind of like Wolfsec Integrators?
Sure. So what I would say is the first thing I think people should be mindful of if they're thinking of going into this field, which obviously I love it. It's a great field. I think that the reasons why I think a lot of people go into this are what I call the three mores, which is more fun, more flexibility, and more money. It's more fun in the sense that because, as we spoke about earlier, you're working on these higher order activities where you're making much greater impact, a lot less of the admin or, non-higher impact activities. It's more fun, right? Because you feel like you're making a big difference. You're spending more of your time on more high impact activities. So you get more satisfaction from it. You get a satisfaction from driving major change, seeing, not just managing something over 10 years, you're actually seeing major impact on your efforts. So that just makes it more fun and more satisfying. There's more flexibility because, when I mentioned, typically people are working, if let's say you're working about 3 days a week, that's about 3 days of client, 3 clients at a time, that's about 3 days a week of client time. And then about 2 days a week of buffer time, right? Working on your own solo practitioner business, on business development, on networking, and on driving your kids to a sports conference and taking off a Friday or taking off a Monday. And just that extra flexibility is is like a nice quality of life for people that want to go into that. And the other thing is more money, which is that you can honestly make more in about 3 days a week of client time than you can in most, full-time, even executive roles. Because again, because it's scalable, you only pay for what you're getting. So by the hour, so to speak, you're getting paid a lot more.
Yeah.
And so, when the client gets out of that is they get the flexibility. It's not a full-time hire. It's no big overhead. It's less of a commitment. They could end it after 9 months. You achieve what you need and then you end. But, it's not so nice to fire your CFO after 9 months. But if it's fractional, that was the plan to begin with.
Yeah.
So you just have that flexibility and then you pay for that, right? If you convert it to hourly, so to speak. So you make more money than you do with the full-time, at least when you're fully booked or close to it. So that's what I would say. But then how do you know if it's for you? Right? So one thing I would keep in mind is that understandably, you can't be effective doing exactly the same things that you did when you're full-time.
Yeah.
You just have to recognize that it's different. You can't be effective in driving change and getting results on a fractional basis with just a few hours a week or a few hours a month as you can when you're full-time where you're there all the time. It's just very different. You have to recognize that it's not just more of the same, right? It's going to be a brand new set of skills. It's a lot of things you're going to have to be very mindful of. And the last, at least high level point I would say is that it's important to understand is that business development / networking / building a pipeline of potential clients, especially if you're a solo practitioner, is part of your job. If you don't view business development as part of your job, and it will always be part of your job, not just when you're first getting started, but always be part of your job. If you don't love that, or at least recognize and embrace it as the reality, then you actually won't be successful transitioning to fractional. You may feel like, I'll just do some kind of big effort when I first go independent. And then, maybe that works. Sometimes that will work. And then you'll stop. You'll get, let's say, a full load of clients for the first time and you'll stop doing business development. But ultimately, your network and the network of your network eventually peters out and you'll eventually have no pipeline and your clients will end. Vast majority of them will end at some point. So whether it's 6, 9, 12, 18 months down the road, your clients will start to end. You'll find yourself with no pipeline, no clients, and getting back to panic mode. And you'll just find yourself in this feast or famine roller coaster that is just not giving you the 3 mores, not going to give you the life that you think you're going to have. So I would the biggest thing I would say is, are you able to embrace the idea of business development as a long-term part of your job description, just like client service is a long-term part of your job description?
So there's a lot more to think about when you kind of go at it as a solo, as opposed to joining a firm who's doing it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And look, and there's all kinds of firms. Some firms you still have to do a lot of business development, some you have to do less. So there's a big mix of how that works. The other resources I would point people towards if they want to learn about this or exploring going into it, is first of all, read my book. It's written for business owners, but I've had, fractional leadership, landing executive talent you thought was out of reach. I've had a ton of people who tell me that, even though, again, it's written from the perspective or for the business owners, the audience, that as going into it, it helped them tremendously, gave them terminology, gave them a good understanding of what it takes. So definitely read the book. It's on Audible, paper, hardcover, Kindle, whatever. Another thing is there's a good community with a lot of education called Voyager U, Voyageeur, like Voyager, Voyageur, like university.com. And they have, it's only $19 a month, I believe. They've also got like a boot camp. They've got courses and materials. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but just pointing that out as a useful resource as voyageru.com as someplace to go to like learn more about it, see if you're cut out for it, connect, you'd also connect in the community there with a lot of other people in the field. So that's a good thing to consider to learn more.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we'll try to put some of these links into the show notes for the audience so they can check out Ben's book and everything. And Ben, maybe as a last question to kind of wrap up the conversation, this has been a great one. How do you kind of see fractional leadership transforming the business landscape as we go into the future?
I think the biggest thing I see about it, first of all, it's been exploding the last few years. I mean, it's been around for decades technically, but especially in the CFO field, that's like really the first field where it really exploded. But over the last 5 years, it's grown a lot. And then post-COVID, it's gotten even bigger because of what you referenced earlier. People getting more open-minded to not being physically present with people. And even though that's not the same as fractional, because you can have fractional that's also in person, but it just opened people's minds to finding talent in ways that they were closed to earlier. So I think it's part of why it really expanded even more with the advent of COVID and all the lockdowns. But I would say that the biggest impact it makes on businesses is it just, what it's really done is it has democratized access to very high level, very experienced talent to an extent that didn't exist before. Because if the only way you could hire a CFO was full-time hiring a CFO, and that was prohibitive for some reason for you, then you had no access to that talent.
Yeah.
Right. But what it's done is democratized and allowed smaller and smaller businesses, right? First, it wasn't just the big companies. Now, then it's the mid-sized businesses. And then it's democratized down even to small businesses that can now access and have people of that caliber who've run those departments or run companies or owned companies before, like on their team as a regular part of their leadership team, just doing so fractionally. So it's just democratized access to much higher level talent to much smaller businesses than who previously had access to it. So I would say that's the biggest thing that's transformative about it and makes it useful.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, Ben, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I know it's been really, I've learned a lot today, and I hope our audience has as well.
I appreciate it. And I would just say also, even without getting the book, if people go to wolfsedgeintegrators.com/resources, there's actually a free chapter of the book, chapter 1 of the book you can get access to there. It doesn't cost anything. I just want to put that out there as well if people want to learn more.
Right. Yeah. And like I said, check the notes, show notes, and we'll put a link to that in our show today.
Awesome. Thank you for the opportunity, Adam. I hope it was a value add for the audience.
Thank you.
This has been Count Me In, IMA's podcast, providing you with the latest perspectives of thought leaders from the accounting and finance profession. If you like what you heard and you'd like to be counted in for more relevant accounting and finance education, visit IMA's website at www.imanet.org.